Well, good evening, Bern. Welcome along this Tuesday evening to our 8th Zoom meeting held under the auspices of the Lodge Hope of Karachi number 337 here in the province of Fife and Kinross, the beautiful ancient kingdom of Fife. Just to remind you all, under the Grand Lodge of Scotland guidance, as the moderator, I do need to see your looks, so I need to have your video on. But can I ask you all to ensure that you're muted at all times? I will be checking all the way through that you are muted, and you should all be muted just now. This evening, I'm delighted to be able to introduce to you quite a well-known brother now in Scotland's shores. Moses has been over a few times. And particularly last year, he did his tour on behalf of Prostate Scotland and spoke on numerous occasions about a variety of subjects that are close to his heart, in particular his work within the Port Authority of New York, New Jersey, and the Emergency Services Unit there, and his experiences during those dreadful times with the attack on the Twin Towers. But this evening, Moses is here to talk to us about another part of American history. But just as a quick word of introduction, I'll give you a very quick background on Moses. He's a member of the Atlas Pythagoras Lodge number 10, located in Westfield, New Jersey. And he was raised in 2008, and he was a worshipful master in 2012. And he's the Grand Historian of the Grand Lodge of New Jersey, and he's had that during 2015, 18 and 19, and has presided over 8 different Masonic bodies and has membership in over 40 Masonic organizations, research groups and society. As I said, he's worked for the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey for 30 years as a member of the Emergency Service Unit stationed at the George Washington Bridge. And those of you who visited New York will be aware of the George Washington Bridge. And at this time, I'd like to see if I can unmute Moses and hand over to you. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, my brother, and welcome you all, brethren. It's always a pleasure to speak to you all. I would love to be there in person. However, the current situation is keeping us slightly apart, even here in my home state. I've gone into doing many Zoom meetings, which is, I guess, another way of keeping in touch with the brethren. But as something bad happens, something good happens. I think Zoom is going to open up possibilities and opportunities for brethren around the world to stay connected, even though we may not be able to travel and meet each other. But this lecture here, I did present it at Lodge St. Peter's number 331 last year in November. And it's a topic that is very dear to me. And it's very prevalent here in the United States on how particularly Freemasonry had a hand in what we now call the Underground Railroad, which was simply a means of slaves in the South escaping their bondage into the free states in the North or into Canada, which was at that time free of slavery as well. And how these individuals, abolitionists, aided and assisted these individuals in finding their escape and their freedom. Now, slavery is nothing new. It's been around for countless of thousands of years, from ancient times to biblical times. Even up to more recent years, we've had slaves in some parts of the world, and now human trafficking seems to be the other form of slavery, which is still going on to this day. Now, the earliest known text or document in the world that speaks about slavery is the stone monoliths that were deciphered and found dating back from Mesopotamia. And when they were able to encode or decrypt the hieroglyphics, they broke them into laws. And Law 15 claims and states, if anyone take a male or female slave of the court, or a male or female slave of a freedman outside the city gates, he shall be put to death. And that is the first known instance of slavery. Now, again, we're going to take you through the history here of the United States and how it started. Now, the United States has just recently gained its independence, creating that all men were created equal. However, that was not to be in certain cases. And one of the first laws that the United States imposed upon its people was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. And this is very lengthy, but for the most part, it guarantees the slave owner the right to recover an escaped slave. So right off the bat, after fighting for what we were ensuring all men to be equal and free, we impose rules against people of color or slaves. Now, slavery is nothing new. It's, like I said, it's a worldwide phenomenon. Every major empire in the world has had slaves. But in the United Kingdom, in 1807, the British Empire decided to abolish the importation and exportation of slaves. It was still legal to have. However, you can no longer bring in or export slaves. Now, one misconception that people have is that slaves were always slaves even when they were brought onto these shores here in America, which is not true. Slaves were not slaves here. They were free people, born free in other lands, and were taken against their will by other individuals, and then brought into, for the most part, the Caribbean, and there, especially in Cuba and Havana, were sold on the market to slaves across and merchants across the country and around the world here in the United States. So that's one misconception that people have, is when they say slaves were slaves, and that's not true. It was slaves. They became slaves and sold into slavery because of the acts of those individuals taking them. Now, in 1834, the British Empire decides to abolish slavery throughout the entire world, wherever they had their dominion. And in 1835, they signed a treaty with France, also abolishing slavery. So these two superpowers, had now abolished slavery in their own lands and wherever they had colonies around the world. However, here in the United States, we did start to slowly but surely follow the same suit. In 1807, we see that the United States creates laws mimicking the British Empire, abolishing the importation and exportation of slaves. But for the most part, that's where it ends. In 1850, the United States enacts the Fugitive Slave Law Act of 1850, which requires the return of an escaped slave to their owners, regardless what state they live in. Now, for the most part, if you were able to free yourself, or you were freed and brought to a northern state where there were no slaves allowed, you were thought to be safe. However, the laws now said that if an escaped person or a slave was taken illegally from a property or an owner and lived or resided in a free state, regardless where they are now, they had the right to be returned to their rightful owner and slave master. And in 1857, a major case made it to the Supreme Court, the highest court in our land. It was Dred Scott versus Sanford. And this specifically was ruled unanimously that Black slaves and their descendants can't gain American citizenship, and that slaves aren't entitled to freedom even if they have lived in states for years. So as other parts of the world were loosening their grip or ending slavery, here in the United States, up until 1857, we were tightening our grip, enforcing the rules and the laws of slavery, making them die hard here in the United States and harder to get rid of. Now, abolitionist is a movement or a term that's given to individuals here and around the world for those who were trying to free slaves or aid in the aiding and getting rid of slavery. And for the most part, most of them here in the United States were Quakers. It seems like Quakerism was a big powerhouse for abolitionists because of their faith in belief in God and in nature. And they believed that slavery was an act against the rules of God and the laws of God and the laws of nature. For the most part, that kind of started here in Vermont. And Vermont at that time was not a state, but it did pass laws here in the colonies for the first time, ending slavery. So it kind of trickled from that time period, just after the start of the Revolutionary War. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, as you see here, really made it tough for individuals to gain their freedom or ending of slavery. And at that time, we had the largest political party, which was the Democratic Party. We had not yet had the Republican Party. And we had smaller little bodies, the Whigs, the Free Soil Party, the Liberty Party, who for the most part were pushing and advocating the end of slavery. However, the Democrats at that time were indeed diehard pro-slavery individuals. They had the majority of vote, and for the most part, as is different today, it's kind of mixed and matched and vice versa. Democrats in those times were the leading party, and they were in favor of slavery for the most part. And as you see there, they had a ruling vote of 82% voted for that Slave Act. That gives you an idea of the mentality of the Democrats here during that time period. Now, one thing that came out of this was the slave bills, as you see here, or the auction block. As the laws of 1808 here in the United States, as it was in the British Empire and France, you can no longer import or export slaves. So how would you continue that propagation of slavery, and how would you continue to own slaves? As a plantation owner, if I own a large home and a plantation, my slaves are getting older as I am getting older, and eventually I would want to leave my children or my heirs something. I couldn't go to Cuba or the Caribbean to buy and import slaves, so what they created was auction houses, as you see in the top right-hand corner. And this was strictly created so that you can buy and sell slaves. Usually there were young children or young virile women especially who can go on and produce more slaves and have give birth to many, many children. The children of slaves will become slaves themselves. And here, even if a slave owner had come into hard times, he could actually sell his slaves and be able to recuperate some of his money or his investments to pay off bills or debts that he may have acquired. The other part was the slave catchers bills. Now, a slave catcher is similar to what we call here a bounty hunter, which is still legal. And if an individual has been cited with a crime or charged with a crime and posts a bail for his freedom temporarily, a bail bondman could hire a bondsman or a bounty hunter in order to retrieve that individual who may have jumped bail and skipped the court appearance. Well, in those days, they also had something similar, and they called slave catchers. They would be hired by the owners and given proper documentation and paperwork to prove that that particular slave was his. And he had the right to cross lines and states and even enter into the North. And by the laws of 1850, if he was to locate that slave and prove that that was the slave in question, he can then take him to a magistrate court. There he would be released into his custody, and he would bring him back to the slave master or the plantation owner, in which he would return to him for a fee for capturing that slave. So this was very prevalent in those days. Now, how do we get involved with this North and South mess that was created here? The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was created to kind of distinguish the North and the South. The southern states would now become slave states, and the northern states above the Ohio River, east of the Mississippi, would become the free northern states. And this was passed by Congress, and this is how they kind of broke the boundary line between the two factions. Now, throughout our history, we have had individuals here in the United States and around the world, for that matter, who were Freemasons themselves and used their powers and premise to advocate the cause of ending slavery and the pro-abolitionist movement. Rufus King was an interesting individual. He was not only a minister to Britain, he was a U.S. senator. He ran twice for president and vice president under the Free Soil and Free Liberty Party tickets, because he was hoping to be able to get into office and to immediately try to remove slavery from the grips of this evil in this country. However, he failed on both attempts because, as most of the Democrats realized, that if they were to elect this individual, that his mindset was to end slavery. That was going against the grain of the slave owners here. Now, the next interesting portion of history happened, which was the Armistead incident in 1841. This was a ship which was port in Havana, Cuba, had recently purchased slaves and was heading up towards the United States when he was intercepted by a British frigate off the coast of New York City.
What are you doing in the sun?
And here, he had the slaves had actually revolted on this ship. Brethren, I believe someone has an open mic which might be interfering with.
Come to the surgery this afternoon and keep out of the sun, honestly. I don't know why I bother.
Gordon, if you might be able to mute that individual, that brother? I believe someone has an open mic.
Oh,
If you might be able to mute everybody. There's too much background noise. One, we see the incident of the Armistead movement. These were slaves on the ship who had revolted and had killed all their enslavers, except the captain and the first mate, hoping that they would steer them back to Africa. They were intercepted off the coast of Long Island here in New York City, and they were brought to court in a jurisdiction in Connecticut. And here it played a pivotal role because many factions wanted to lay claim, including the newly reigned and installed Queen Isabella of Spain, who was about 13 years old, and demanded of the United States that due to the treaty between the two nations of 1795, that if we seize any cargo vice from either country, that the cargo would be returned to that proprietor of that country in ownership. So she, being the Queen of Spain, claimed that these slaves were her property and that she demanded the property back. However, this went all the way to the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land. And in 1841, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the African slaves, giving them their freedom. Now, this was unique because out of the 9 justices, 7 themselves were Southern plantation owners, and they unanimously voted with one abstention that these individuals were indeed free people, born free, and were put in a situation where their freedoms and liberties were taken away. And they had every right to fight for their insurrection and the freedoms and the liberties that were taken away, even even having to kill their oppressors. And this was a very prominent case here in America because for the first time, the highest court in the land has agreed with people of color having the right to pursue happiness and liberty, and even in the defense of their liberties, to revolt and have to kill people as well in order to maintain their freedoms. So this was a very big push by the abolitionists, who, by the way, hired John Quincy Adams, our 6th president, to defend them in the Supreme Court and make their state and their claim. So the abolitionist movement was very uplifted and they were empowered by this decision made by the Supreme Court. Now, the next step was to hire and eventually bring about all of these small parties, unite them together, and go and create what is now the Republican Party. Now, this was a party that was created in the consolidation of a few smaller individual parties. Most of the leaders of these individual parties were all Freemasons, all abolitionists, and tremendous leaders in that underground movement. And they decided to pick this 6'4" statue of a man who was a great orator, a great speaker, a great statesman, a great lawyer, in the name of Abraham Lincoln, who himself had some views towards slavery. He wasn't convinced that slavery was 100% be easily eradicated, though he thought it was wrong. He felt that because it was so interwoven with the fabric of America and our economic situation, that ending it might be detrimental to our economic status here, as you're now freeing people who were here to work as laborers, cheap laborers. But nevertheless, he does fulfill the promise of the abolitionist movement. He gets elected as the first Republican president. And of course, the South was not too happy. So shortly after, the Civil War breaks out. And the Civil War battled for several years, pitting brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor, North against the South. And this war becomes a very bloody, very costly war. It is probably one of the most costliest war in terms of lives that America has suffered in all the years and all the battles that we have been a part of. But during that time, Lincoln comes through and holds his position, and he puts forth the Emancipation Proclamation. And in 1863, he puts this piece of parchment out, ensuring the freedoms and rights of all slaves, ending slavery and servitude here in the United States forever. However, because this was done during wartime, the president, as the president does today, has what we have called the War Powers Act. It gives him power to create edicts and create documents and create orders and executive decisions. However, anything he does after the war will have to be brought back to Congress, or to the seat of our legislative body, to be voted and ratified and approved. Now, Lincoln being the statesman that he was, realized that if he did not get this document approved and made an amendment to the Constitution, that it would not go through if the war ended. He realized he needed the war to continue and this amendment to be finally approved, because both sides were realistically getting tired of this war, which was costing many, many lives and money on both sides and economic hardship. So finally, Lincoln and his staff do what many political leaders have done throughout the ages. They go out and they buy and sell votes. And this they did with individuals who approached other politicians, as the Democrats did have a majority lead, and needed, in order to get a 2/3 vote, needed several on both sides. And there they offered individuals money or bribes or positions in order to get them to vote for this amendment. And in 1865, the 13th Amendment becomes law, finally, officially ending slavery here and servitude once and for all. Now, unfortunately, this is a three-part step, as we're going to discuss. The first was the ending of slavery. The second was the right to vote. And the third was the creation of the Civil Rights Bill and the ending of segregation, which we'll get into later on. Now, in 1870, the 15th Amendment comes out, guaranteeing all men in this country the right to vote. Now, notice I say all men because our ladies yet had the right to vote. And that would not come until the 19th Amendment in 1920, when the ladies indeed finally had the right to vote, or all Americans, citizens born in this country and attaining the age of 18 had the right to vote. Now, when the 13th Amendment was ratified, not all of the states indeed were behind it. My own home state here in New Jersey had to ratify it several times before they actually got approved. Delaware, a northern state, did not ratify it until 1901. Texas took some time, Kentucky, but the longest holdout was Mississippi. They did not ratify it until 1995, and then it was kind of lost for several years, and it wasn't found again until 2013, when it was read before Congress and then finally entered into the books as officially recognizing the 13th Amendment. And it goes to show you that that's 2013. That's quite a long time from when that first amendment was actually signed back in 1865. Now, the third and final step was the signing of the Civil Rights Bill, which happened in 1865 with Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was also an apprentice Mason. And you see Martin Luther King behind him there signing it. And this was the final step of integrating all Americans together. Now, although you were free, although you can have slaves, although you had the right to vote, you can still be kept down by the acts of segregation. And segregation, for those you may not know, meant that you couldn't drink in the same water fountain as a white person. You couldn't use the same restroom or the loo as a white person. If you were in a taxi or in a bus, you had to sit in the back. Even though seats in the white section were empty, if the black section was filled, you couldn't get on the bus. You had to wait. And in schools were segregated as well in many parts of the country. So this was a way of ending all that and allowing for integration of civil society throughout the entire nation. Now, what got me interested in this lecture was as I was giving a talk in Cincinnati, Ohio, at a lodge there that was chartered by New Jersey many, many years ago. I came across this beautiful museum, which I had never known about, called the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center. And this museum is dedicated solely to the whole concept of that underground movement, which happened during those years before the Civil War. Now, as our brother introduced me, as I told you, I work for the Port Authority, and my first station was the Holland Tunnel, and this tunnel was the first vehicular tunnel built for the purpose of transporting cars under a river or underground in a tunnel. And this opened up in 1927. It was my first station, my first duty when I worked at the Port Authority. And one unique thing I post this here why is because, brethren, if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. And if you don't write your history, someone else will write it for you. Now, I had a brother who I was giving this lecture come up to me, and he kind of explained to me how today's age, we have so many difficulties in trying to build a new passenger train tunnel between New York and New Jersey. And yet back in the 1850s, before the Civil War, we had this Underground Railroad, which was working beautifully. And I was kind of waiting for the punchline or the joke, which never came. And the brother was actually adamantly convinced that it was so. And I had to tell him, brother, I don't know where you got your information from, but there was no train that you would pick up in Alabama and the next stop was New York City and you were free. It did not exist. There was no actual train tunnel. However, he was quite shocked to hear that. And I was surprised as well. But later on, when he heard the lecture, he understood it more. And this was what the Underground Railroad looked like. It was a series of off-the-beaten-path roads, never usually used more than a few times or only once. It was in the dark, at night, usually in the cold, in the rain, in the snow, in the heat, through swamps and bogs, and usually during the cover of darkness. They used a system of the North Star and the stars above to help them guide them to freedom. And some of these individuals trekked 1,000 miles or more to gain their independence and freedom. Now, there were four main routes. One was through the Midwest, South Midwest, that went up across the Ohio River, which was one of the largest crossings of slaves during that time period. The other was in the lower Southeast and ran up through my home state here in New Jersey, which became a big location and center for the Underground Railroad movement. And we also have two arrows pointing, one down towards Texas and one towards the Caribbean. Well, at that time, the reason it did that is because two revolutions occurred, led by two Freemasons. Benito Juarez led a revolution to free his oppressors and imperial rule in Mexico, offering freedom to all and equality to all. And the other one was Toussaint Louverture from Haiti. And he led the first slave revolt ever known in modern history in Haiti against his oppressors of the French. And there he gained his independence and welcomed all as equal men and women according to the laws of his land, and would no longer have slaves or invested into slavery there in his country. So many went and sought refuge in these places or in the Caribbean because any British or French island, or especially British island in years to come, would be free of slaves as well. So many people went to the Caribbean and to Mexico to find or seek freedom. Now, as we move into the Freemason part of it, one of the first individuals we come to is Prince Hall. Prince Hall was what I consider the father of the civil rights movement. He was a man who was born free in the Barbados and was sold into slavery, or so the records go. And he immigrated here into the United States, into the Boston, Massachusetts area, and there gained his freedom. He became educated. He was an incredible writer and speaker and orator. And during the Revolutionary War, he joins an Irish military lodge and becomes a legal Freemason. Now, of course, as we know, military lodges tend to cease once the campaigns are over and fall back to their mother grand jurisdictions. So he found himself without a home. Seeking fellowship during the period after the Revolutionary War, he was astonished to find that because of the color of his skin, he was not accepted, even as a Freemason. So he petitions the Grand Master of England, and there he is given a charter, Africanus Lodge number 459, and charters his own lodge in Boston, Massachusetts. And this would eventually grow worldwide to become known as we know it today as Prince Hall Freemasonry worldwide. That was given that title after his death. All Prince Hall affiliate lodges around the world and Grand Lodges are now named Prince Hall in his honor. But one thing that Prince Hall did was he spoke adamantly about the abolitionist of slaves, the freedom of slaves, the ending of slavery, the freedoms and the rights for all individual. And he was a modern thinker of his time. But most predominantly, he used the craft, and he instilled among his brethren to continue to educate those individuals. Use the craft to educate and to not only educate, but to inspire those individuals to do good and go out and help in the abolitionist movement. And once again, also help in eventually, hopefully, creating laws to get rid of slavery and end it for all. So he was very astute man, but he was very concerned and very inspired by the fact that his mantra to all his brethren were to use this as a cause for civil rights and freedoms for all and liberties for all, under the eyes of the laws of our land and under the eyes of God. And he really did use the craft to that end. And to his death, the craft expounded upon that. And today, as we've gone through all the centuries, we have seen that Prince Hall Freemasonry has served an integral part in the civil rights movements from his time all the way right down to the present time today. Now, two of his closest friends, who also became Freemasons, were Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, and they were Methodist preachers. However, because of the color of their skin, they were not allowed to practice or preach to a white congregation. Now, these were men that were born free. They were very well educated. They had served in the ministries. They had gone to seminary school. They had become preachers, but couldn't do anything with their positions. So they decided to break away and create what is now known as the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which is the largest Black congregation or denominational church in the world, and owing its existence to these two individuals. However, they also petitioned Prince Hall to not only become Freemasons, but to grant them a charter so that they can open up a lodge in Philadelphia, as other grand jurisdictions charter lodges around the world and in other states. And this Prince Hall did. He gave them a charter. And with these individuals, not only took the mantra of what Prince Hall was practicing and preaching, instilling abolitionist movement and civil rights and freedoms for all, these two individuals decided to marry the church, the pulpit, and Freemasonry together. And this, to this day, is the greatest connection that two of these institutions had, was Prince Hall Freemasonry and the AME Church, which was founded in Philadelphia. And to this day, believe it or not, this church and this plot of land is the oldest known parcel of land or property which has been in a Black community or a Black organization's hand in the United States. It's been owned by a Black community or the Black church for over 225 years. This magnificent church, which dates from 1789, is the third church built there. And so was the union between the church and Freemasonry, that when they built the church in 1889, the stained glass window facing the east was bought and paid for by the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania. And there it depicts many Masonic symbols out in the open, not in secrecy, not in hiding, but proudly displaying the connection between the two organizations, which not only helped aid in the abolitionist movement and the free African societies and free vigilant societies, the Underground Railroad movement, but also post-Civil War and right on through the modern time, not only including gaining the right to vote, gaining the right of freedoms, and gaining the rights of civil rights, which is incredible how these two, to this day, still have the greatest union between church and a fraternalism, which is kind of unlikely that even these days, as we know that the Catholic Church has many bans on Freemasonry, but here we see these two growing together. Now, William Still is considered the father of the Underground Railroad movement and was also a Freemason born free here in New Jersey. And he also used the craft and was a member of that lodge that was first formed in Philadelphia. Now, one thing that he did do, and he's very well known for, was for the organization of this movement, but also because of his journals and his diaries. Every slave he came in contact that was freed and brought to him, he would sit there and ask them an entire history of their life. And he wrote down all of the biographies of all these individuals he came across. Today, we have based our information on this movement because of the book he printed later on in his life, the narratives of William Still. And there we find what he actually did and how this movement actually grew and worked, and also how many Freemasons, not even knowing, were involved and where I've been able to draw information from. Now, these next two individuals here, what actually kind of drew me into this lecture, William Lambert and George D. Baptiste, were born free men. William Lambert was from New Jersey, born a free man here in New Jersey. And these two individuals had separate paths, but met in Detroit. And Detroit became one of the hotbeds of the underground movement, in particular for the railroad movement of abolitionists and the freeing of slaves. And these men were very wealthy, and they were the financiers and the backers of this underground movement. However, they were also Freemasons, and realizing that many individuals who were dedicating their lives to the cause of abolitionism and ending of slavery, white and black, some were getting injured, some were losing their lives. But you have to put yourself in that mindset. You were stealing someone's property. Whether it was human or not, right or wrong, under the eyes of the law here, that human being was not a human being, but was considered a piece of property or commodity. No different than me entering your home or trying to steal your car. They had every right to protect themselves. They have every right to kill you for trespassing on their land and stealing what effectively was their property. So many of these individuals were suffering or being killed or never showing up or just disappearing. So these two individuals, being Freemasons, having that connection between the AME Church and Freemasonry, and following in the leaders of the principal Freemasonry, they decided to organize what they called the Order of the Men of Oppression. Now, while walking around in this museum, I see these wonderful displays. And one of them, as I enlarged here, says, in Detroit, George D. Baptiste and William Lambert used passwords, secret signals, and special handshakes to identify those working in the Underground Railroad movement. Now, during that time period, what other organization do we see that actually uses the same type of passwords and signals and handshakes to identify each other but Freemasonry? So these two individuals create what is now known today as the Order of the Men of Oppression, and they modeled it as a Freemason Masonic lodge. They actually called it a lodge. They had three main degrees, and one was called Chosen, the second was called Captive, the third was called Redeemed, and then the third degree had 5 minor degrees which you had to go through depending how high you rose in the rank of the underground movement. So the higher you achieved position or rank in that movement, whether you became a conductor, which was a person who transported physical slaves from slavery to free states, these individuals created an entire order based off the principles and ritual of Freemasonry, including lectures, degrees. They circumambulated their candidates. They were stripped of their garments as well. The person who was similar to a senior deacon or would ask and answer the questions on his behalf. So these candidates had much of this. And the other part of it was they actually used the implements of slavery, as we in Freemasonry use the implements of our operative stonemasons, the square, the level, the plumb. They used the implements of slavery. Chains, floggings, whips, shackles. This was to impose upon them a uniqueness and impart upon them this incredible realistic degree on how a slave actually lived his life and the sufferings of them. He was clad in rough, ragged garments. His head was bowed. His eyes were blindfolded and an iron chain put about his neck. This was how a candidate was prepared to receive these degrees. So it was very interesting how these individuals actually created an order based off of Freemasonry and used the settings of a lodge and the administrative lodge settings to continue this degree and to continue this movement, which eventually did save lives and also had many thousands of members involved as well. Now, one of the areas where I've been able to find writings that actually lets me see firsthand accounts of how Freemasonry handled and was a part of this movement was because around 1935, we had what was called the Federal Writers Project. And the Federal Writers Project was created to instill upon these individuals to go out and locate these people who were once slaves or anyone who was left alive and to document their stories firsthand. They didn't want to listen to their sons or their grandchildren or read it from a book, but to preserve the authenticity. This project was created to go out and record verbally these stories. Now, here's one particular I was able to find. Henry Webb reported that a slave was told that runaway slaves came across the Ohio River from Portland, which is now part of Louisville, Kentucky. Plans for the escapes were concocted in a Black Masonic lodge, and the slaves posed across the river, and the boat operated by these men posing as fishermen. Now, there's there's tens of thousands of documents and reported journals that have been written down. I've been slowly but surely going through quite a few of them, and I've found many instances where Freemasonry was actually depicted and actually explained, even though they weren't looking for particular Freemasons doing this type of work. It just so happened that that person they interviewed was helped and aided by a Freemason. Now, in another instance, I have read that there was a young woman who was brought to the river, the Ohio River, and there she was to await a boat crossing the river at a certain hour. And these men came across, and interestingly enough, many had aprons. And in her story, as she recounts it, she tells the writer that these individuals named Masons or Freemasons, who brought me across the river to a Masonic lodge, must have had something to do with cooking, because they all seem to have worn aprons, I guess, to keep themselves from getting dirty or soiled. So here, not even knowing what Freemasonry or Masonic lodge, but she describes these individuals as Freemasons from what she hears and she sees. And there are many stories like this that have been told in these writings and in many other writings, which I've been culminating and putting together and correlating so I can eventually put it in a book and be able to explain exactly how Freemasonry played a big hand in this movement. Now, another individual who had a big hand and showed his kind of side was the first Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, John Graves Simcoe. He brings Freemasonry into that part of the world. He's a Freemason himself. He associates himself with many Freemasons in high-ranking positions. And their first legislative body that he chooses to operate his parliament was in a Masonic lodge room, Niagara-on-the-Lake, which is still there today. Now, he does something different. The British Empire will not abolish slavery until 1833. But yet, when he comes across to Canada, along with many of his constituents and many of his friends who were Freemasons, he decides that, you know what, slavery is wrong. It goes against the grain. And if you're a Freemason, you definitely should not have or own slaves. So he puts together this Act against Slavery, which passes in July of 1793. And this is why Canada became a safe haven for newly freed slaves here in America, because at that time, Canada had become free of slaves over a certain time period. It wasn't completely 100% free, but for the first time, we see an act or some sort of law being put forth by a governing body, here the Parliament of Upper Canada. And it is created mainly and majority by Masons. Many led this organization, and many led this cause. And where does this actual vote and act of legislation against slavery take place? But inside the Masonic Lodge in Upper Canada. So it's amazing that a Masonic Lodge was the premise and the host on what would become the first anti-slavery act ever created. And it's amazing that he was able to continue to do this, being that he was still part of the British Empire. And 40 years later, the British Empire would follow suit on what Canada did so many years ago. Now, we move on to John Brown. He was an American abolitionist. He was a Freemason. John Brown was born into a family of Quakers. His father was a Freemason as well. And they believed that Freemasonry was a integral part of their life, but that slavery was, from the onset, wrong. John Brown took a little bit different. Most abolitionists believed in a pacifist movement. They were non-violent, non-cooperation, but they really did not seek violence unless it was to defend themselves. However, John Brown was the quintessential opposite. He was on the opposite side of that spectrum. And he believed that armed insurrection was the only way to overthrow the institution of slavery here in the United States. And he even came up with the idea of creating an order which is called the Order of the Gileadites. And this was an order based on Freemasonry as well. And he used this group to recruit membership to begin his campaign on armed insurrection across the United States. Now, so inspired and so incredible was this man, except that most of the abolitionist leaders, including William Still, William Lambert, and Frederick Douglass, met with him in Detroit to kind of calm him down. And it was actually the only white person in the room. And they were begging him, we admire your enthusiasm, we appreciate what you're doing, but you just can't go around burning people's homes down, especially white plantation owners. It's not the way we want to go. And they were bringing this to his attention because he was orchestrating the taking over of a munitions depot in Virginia, which led to the raid on Harper's Ferry. And this raid actually took place with 22 individuals, some freed slaves, some abolitionists, and their intention was to take this garrison, control the garrison, take all the munitions and weapons and black powder and cannons, and literally go around the countryside, freeing city by city, kind of like Spartacus, freeing the slaves and creating a slave revolt. Of course, with 22 men, it's hard to do significant damage to a garrison. And a contingent of Marines led in by Colonel Robert E. Lee, who would later on lead and become the general of the Civil Confederate Army. And there, this movement was put to rest. The slaves were returned to slavery. Many were tried and convicted and killed. Some were sentenced to back to slavery, and some were sentenced to jail. However, John Brown was hung right after he was found guilty. And one of the reasons they were so hard about this is because they can understand the person of color trying to free themselves. But for a white man to incite insurrection against white people in a southern plantation jurisdiction was unheard of. And they didn't want this to spread. So they quickly brought this to an end. And as a show of force and deterrence, they actually hung him in the town square. And then they was taken down and given a fraternal burial in upstate New York. But this is the mode and method of how some of these individuals were willing to sacrifice their lives, their fortune, even their families in the cause of this movement. Now, just like this next individual that we're going to speak about, James Gillespie Birney, he's a very interesting man. He's born in Kentucky, a slave state, of a wealthy family and wealthy plantation owner who had many slaves. And as he grows older and gets educated, he comes to Princeton University, he becomes a Freemason, and all of these different outside exposures conclude to him that slavery is wrong. And he decides that when it is his time to take over his position in his family, he sells his lands, frees all his slaves, and goes on a lifelong crusade to effectively end slavery as an abolitionist. Now, one interesting part about individual is where he actually went and the focus of it. Now, he had many focuses, whether it be in newspapers, in the Underground Railroad movement. He spoke at many town squares. He spoke at many political rallies. He also created many bills and edicts to eradicate slavery that was whether in the state level or local county level or in the nationwide level. But one interesting pamphlet that he created was a pamphlet that he wrote for and against slavery as an abolitionist pamphlet. Now, where interestingly he does this is that he travels back to his home state in Kentucky, and his mother lodge was Franklin Lodge, which still exists today. And here, he knocks on the lodge door, on the outer door, seeks admission, and asks the worshipful master if he can have permission to speak this pamphlet, to speak what he's going to say here. This individual writes a great pamphlet, which you can all read here in the next two slides. And this is actually written for the purpose of being spread throughout the Masonic community. Now, the master of the lodge accepts it, and he actually has it sent to the local newspapers to have it printed. And he physically states that if you are a Freemason and you own slaves, then you're wrong. You can either be a slave owner or you could be a Freemason, but you can't be both. It goes against the laws of God. It goes against the laws of nature, and it goes against the laws of Freemasonry as we preach that all men are created equal and that we all meet on the level. So this individual has the audacity to go back to southern states, and there in southern lodges, which I'm sure most of those individuals in those lodges were slave owners themselves, and there has the goal to actually preach this pamphlet, this what can be considered, treasonous and blasphemy in the South, and he does this to his brethren. He goes to lodges and asks permission to be able to speak this and say, if you are a Freemason, you shouldn't be owning slaves and you shouldn't abide by the rules of slavery. You should abolish it. Now, he also tries to run for president, and one of his parties, the Liberty Party, joins forces with many other, including 3 other top prominent Freemasons at the time, each of their own leader of their party, to create and formulate what we now have as the Republican Party, which led to the election of Abraham Lincoln. So as we see here, Masonry came together in a very important part. And those 3 individuals have secured a place of honor in that Underground Railroad Museum in Cincinnati, Ohio, because of what they actually did. Shamefully, there's nothing mentioning about Freemasonry, and hopefully that will change as I am working with that museum to eventually, I was supposed to speak later on this year there, but due to the coronavirus, things have been canceled. But we are working to create a display in that museum dedicated to how Freemasonry did aid and assist in this movement and aid in the freedoms of slaves and in civil rights, and also eventually to speak there before that congregation and the same lecture to kind of show them who we actually are and what we've actually done. Now, there's an important community here in New Jersey which still exists today. It's called Lawnside, New Jersey, and this was a community that was created solely by newly freed slaves who were once again traveling through New Jersey, but instead of proceeding further into New York or Canada, they chose to stay in this area because of its proximity to Philadelphia, and Philadelphia was a hotbed for the abolitionist cause. Now, the interesting part is that this building that you see here in the bottom was one of the only known Underground Railroad stations during that time to be owned, built, and operated by a Black man in an all-Black community, predominantly of freed slaves, and had decided to nestle there and make that their home. Now, the first Vigilant Committee, which was solely dedicated to the abolitionist cause and the ending of slavery, which was led by William Still, the secretary was a brother named Ralph Smith. And he would come across the Lawnside as long as William Still, he was born near this area, and he would buy tracts of land and then either give it for free or sell it at a very, very cheap rate so that these slaves were able to buy and purchase land and live as free people. So it's amazing that we see this connection here, of Freemasons being in these top key positions. Now, the other interesting part is that this community never really had a name, or was it incorporated as a city. And in the early 30s, they actually went before the state legislature here in New Jersey. And at that time, our governor was Harry A. Moore, who was a Freemason himself, but he was a very active Freemason. He participated in many ground breaking ceremonies. He participated in many dedications and cornerstone dedications. He really frequently enjoyed Freemasonry and wanted to be that example of who we were. And they approached him in order, the significance of the city, that it would be beneficial and it would do much good to incorporate this and make it a city once and for all. So Harry A. Moore puts his full weight of governor behind it, and it passes, and the city of Lawnside becomes official and is incorporated here in the state of New Jersey as an official city. And this city is one of the few cities in the United States that has that type of background. And if you go to that small community today, the Prince Hall Church is a few blocks away. The AME Baptist Church is a few blocks away. And again, this underground movement, the 3 completing that triangle of how they all worked intimately and together as a close-knit unit. Now, unfortunately, brethren, Freemasonry is a wonderful institution, and it's a great institution, which I believe has perfect intentions. However, we see that individuals or Freemasons aren't always so perfect. And here we see Medgar Evers, who was considered the father of the modern civil rights movement. He was a big advocate in the 50s. He was a well-known Freemason, and he was chosen as the leader and secretary of the NAACP in Mississippi. And he chose to have his headquarters and his offices in the Masonic Temple in Jackson, Mississippi, because of his solidarity and connections with the civil rights movement, with Freemasonry. But unfortunately, on June 2nd, 1963, as he was exiting his car in his driveway to meet his 3 children and his wife, an assassin or assailant across the street, hiding in the bushes, shot him with a high-power rifle in the back, killing him instantly as he lay down on the ground in front of his 3 children and his wife. That individual was named Byron D. LeBeckwith. He also was a Freemason. Now, whether or not he knew he was a Freemason is up to conjecture, and we have no idea. But here we see another Freemason killing another Freemason. Now, as predominantly as Medgar Evers was in the fraternity, the fact that his office was in the Prince Hall Temple, it's safe to say that most likely he knew that he was a Freemason as well. And the interesting part is that this man was not brought to justice for 30 years. He actually spoke about what he did. He wrote it in a book. And it took 30 years to bring him to justice finally, because he swore that no jury would ever convict a white man for killing a black man. And if you get to watch the movie Ghost of Mississippi, it tells the tale and the story of this whole evolution that occurred here and how he was finally brought to justice in 1993. But again, our institution has perfect intentions. Unfortunately, there are others that do not. Now, brethren, I leave this slide up here because the time is always right to do what is right. If you see something wrong or see a crime being committed and you do nothing about it, you're just as guilty as the person committing that crime or that wrong. Now, sometimes this happens in our own lodge rooms as well. Now, brethren, I'm a historian by nature and by virtue of my position as Grand Historian of the Grand Lodge of New Jersey. This is what I like to do. This is what I enjoy doing. Now, I believe sometimes that in our modern times, Freemasons have been caught up in what I call the pomp and circumstance, or in titles, spaghetti dinners and pancake breakfasts, and we forget the real core values of who we are and what we stand for. I believe that when you remove all of what's left behind is a clear example of our core value. Do good unto all and make sure that you are a voice for those who don't have a voice. I believe that wholeheartedly, and I believe the craft was created for that purpose. Now, when I started lecturing many years ago, and this is something I've done in many countries and many states here in the United States, over 300 times, I didn't have a path. Yet when I gave this presentation some time ago, at the request of a brother who had requested me to present a lecture, I was kind of excited because I said, sure, I'll do my 9/11 lecture. And he replied to me, he said, well, I don't want you to do the 9/11 lecture. I want you to do your Underground Railroad lecture. And I kind of posed for a minute. And I said, okay, are you sure this is what you want me to do? You understand that I may not leave your state alive if I do this lecture for the feeling and sentiments. And he said, yes, but the time is right to do what is right. Now, he had heard this lecture before in another location, and he wanted me to bring it down to him. And I gave this lecture, and I gave it in a rural lodge. And when I'm done, this individual comes to me kind of hastily, and I kind of got the impression that he was not too happy. And I said, well, I can't please everybody, but needless to say, this individual comes to me, gives me a huge hug, kisses me on the cheek with tears in his eye, and says, my brother, shame on me, because I have seen evil and bigotry and racism in my lodge, especially against good men who could have been great Masons, but weren't allowed to be entered into this lodge as a brother because of the color of their skin or because of what they preached or professed, of a different faith or creed or color. Shame on me for not standing up always and biting my tongue. But know this, if you ever change anybody's life, know that you've changed mine. And going forward, I will speak when I see something wrong, and I will do what is right all the time, because that's what I professed and swore in my obligations to do. Now, at this point, when he said this, I actually had to walk away because I actually started tearing up myself. And at that instance, at that moment in my life, I had found my goal. I had found my direction and why it was my turn to do what was right. Now, brethren, I know I can't change the world, but if I can change one person, I have done my bit for humanity, and I have done my bit as a Freemason. And that's good enough for me. Wherever I go, that's my mantra now. And my goal to everybody now, Masons and non-Masons alike, is to always do what is right. To do what is right and be that voice, that spark, that advocacy, especially for those who cannot speak for themselves. When you look back at all those individuals from time immemorial, all the way down to our present day, these are Freemasons who are willing to give up their way of life, their fortunes, their families for the benefit of others. Yet they were willing to do that because they fought for something bigger than themselves. And they realized that this was for the greater good of all mankind. And I believe that spark that started and ignited in so many had a big hand in the cause of freedom and liberty around the world, because of what Freemasonry represents for them and to many. But the fact that this is an institution that goes back for centuries, allowing men to meet together as men, regardless of their color, their faith, their culture, or their creed. I may not always agree with a brother. I might not even like that brother, but I have to respect them. And when we enter this lodge, we are equal and meeting on the same level. All men, all people created equal. That's the true spirit of Freemasonry. And I believe that is our greatest core value that we have to offer today. Brethren, in my jurisdiction, when the Right Worshipful Master gives his closing charge, part of it says, do good unto all, especially those of the household of faith. Everyone deserves a good claim upon your kind offering, especially those of the household of faith. And I believe that they say this because the goodness that Freemasonry does is usually kept in the lodge. We come into the lodge, we have this greatness and fellowship in the lodge, we have this goodness, we talk goodness, we respect each other, and then we leave. We close the door and leave all that goodness behind us. And I believe that Freemasonry was intended for us to take it into the world, not just to recruit, but to show who we really are. Not that we raise money for charities, not that we have spaghetti dinners, and we're going to plunge ourselves into the world, but that we are here to show the world that we can meet as human beings together and respect each other, regardless of who or what we believe. And that is our core value that this fraternity offers and has been offering for centuries. And this is what I hope that you all take with you from this lecture today. Do good and spread light. And the brother Mason, when you close that lodge and you leave that lodge, don't leave the goodness and that fellowship that stays behind. Take it with you. Let the world know and see the greatest beauty and treasures we have in a building. It is not relics, it is not old documents, it is not a beautiful, magnificent temple, but it resides in each one of us because of those who have gone before us. We're only here because those who have paved the way for us, and we have to continue those struggles. Imagine the struggles that some of these individuals went through so that we can have our freedoms and meet today as Freemasons. That's very important. So I leave it up to you to do always what is right, to do what is good, and to take this with you. This is the greatest core value our fraternity has to offer. Brethren, may God bless all of you. May God save the Queen. May God continue to bless Scottish Freemasonry and all of Scotland. And particularly during these times, may God bless all first responders, all our veterans past and present, and most particularly all our healthcare workers who are putting themselves in harm's way every day to ensure the freedoms that we have and be able to meet as free men and Freemasons. And most especially, may God continue to shine its beauty on the greatest fraternity in the world, Freemasonry. Thank you, brother.
Moises, I really don't know how to thank you. We've started doing these meetings to try and help the Brennan get a little bit of daily advancement. You certainly have inspired us this evening. And I'm actually quite emotional listening to you. I don't think we actually appreciate the challenges that people faced in the United States. And I think when we look at our Scottish history, particularly in the 18th century in Glasgow, we may have a responsibility, or some of our forebears have got a responsibility to do that, because a lot of money was generated in Glasgow on the back of the slave trade. But I really believe you'll have inspired so many this evening. And I thank you on behalf of all those who have witnessed you here this evening, and those that will watch your presentation when we share it over the course of the next few days. Hopefully we've got some questions. Let me just have a look.
I'll be more than welcome to answer any questions they want.
Okay. Someone says I'm talking like a Dalek. So, let's see.
And it's interesting to note also that abolitionist movement were very strong in the UK and Scotland as well. Not the current Duke of Sussex, but his predecessor, which had not been on for many centuries, was also instrumental in forming the first anti-abolitionist gathering in the world. He was, of course, at that time the Grand Master of Masons in England, and he was surrounded by key players in the abolitionist movement. Many were from the United States who traveled. But when he formed this abolitionist movement, many of whom the backers were Freemasons, they decided to have it at Freemasons Hall in London. So again, we see the fraternity not just using a building, but using what the building stands for. When these men enter these buildings, they're entering on the premise that all men are created equal. That alone inspires these abolitionists, Masons and non-Masons, to think, hey, if it works in here, why can't it work elsewhere around the world? So it's a lot of stories from even abroad, even in your part of the world, that have done much to bolster the abolitionist movement. And the ending of slavery was the first superpower in the world to end slavery. So kudos and respect to everybody there on your side of the pond that did as well, and were very instrumental in this movement as well.
Okay. Moses, the first question, did Prince Hall ever meet prominent Freemasons like George Washington or Benjamin Franklin, who were slave owners?
Not that we know of. We don't know if they actually met in encampments. I don't know for sure if they actually met in battle, but from the looks of it, he didn't really meet too many of the big politicians, as did others. Now, Prince Hall doesn't have that story. It's not mentioned around in books or documents that he met these individuals. However, we do see that and hear that, for instance, Simon Bolivar, the revolutionist down in South America, Francisco de Miranda, Toussaint Louverture, Benito Juarez, these individuals did meet with individuals here and were inspired by the actual causes of liberty and freedoms here in the United States. And they actually did seek audiences with these well-known Masonic individuals here in the United States, which, as far as they are concerned, were inspired by their actions here. So, but unfortunately, we don't know much about who actually Prince Hall actually met during his time, if he actually didn't meet these individuals. And from most of his battles, he really didn't. Most of his battles were up in the high New England area, not really down south in Jersey or further south in Carolinas and Virginia, where the main battles of the Revolutionary War took place. So, unfortunately, we don't know if he actually did or he didn't.
Okay. Another question. Prince Hall was made a Mason in 1775, at a time when slavery was not abolished and where prejudices were rife. Why did a lodge of English-born working under the Grand Lodge of Ireland decide to initiate a black man?
I'm sorry, say that again. You got cut out a little bit. I'm sorry.
Why did a lodge of English brethren working under the Grand Lodge of Ireland, decide to initiate a black man?
He was initiated in a military lodge to begin with, and when he was initiated, he was quickly initiated, and there was no issues or questions about him being initiated. At one point, they said that because you weren't born a free man, which is what many of our jurisdictions had in their wording, and that you couldn't become a Freemason, but that was quickly removed. But he had no issues in becoming an Irish Freemason during the war, and it's said that the constitutions of Scotland, England, and Ireland were actually more open to free men, especially men of color, to join than were his colonial brothers who he fought side by side to eradicate and to start a new country based on those same principles. And as soon as the war was over, he was ostracized and cast out, even as a brother Mason, which was hard to believe that. But apparently there was no issues because the Grand Master of England, I mean, in those times, it wasn't as quickly as we would like it as we have it today, but within 3 years, he received the charter. And of course, it takes time for correspondence to travel back and forth across the pond, but the Grand Master of England, the United Grand Lodge of England, did not have any issues with him becoming, not even the fact that his Masonic initiation or his Masonic patents were questioned, but the fact that they gave him his charter, and that charter has become the basis of all Prince Hall charters around the world. And everywhere they have gone, they have done some good. And it's amazing that there are certain Grand Lodges here in the United States that can't even trace their path directly to the Mother Grand Lodge of England. As we all know, that's the basis of recognition as we have it today. You have to show your lineage. But Prince Hall owes it directly to that first charter, which was granted by the Grand Lodge of England. So it's amazing that they actually have a better pedigree and a better lineage than most Grand Lodges in the United States.
Thank you, Moses. Are people who are not black allowed to join Prince Hall lodges?
Yes. This is the other side of the flip coin. Now, many people here in the States, and I have to speak both truths and both sides of the coin. Prince Hall sometimes is the one that actually puts up the barriers, and not the fact that there's still lodges and states in this jurisdiction and here in the United States that don't accept men of color or don't accept Prince Hall Freemasonry as their equals. But unfortunately, sometimes it's Prince Hall that puts up the roadblocks to prevent that, because Prince Hall has had a long history of fighting for the rights of their people, for the rights of civil liberties, to the rights of freedoms, to the ending of slavery, to the right to vote. And mainstream Masonry has been very open in the last 10 or 15 years in the United States, accepting all men, regardless of your color. And sometimes I feel that Prince Hall Masonry is losing its identity because more and more of their of men of color in this country, African Americans, are going to mainstream Grand Lodges. But in New Jersey here, for instance, we signed an accord which gave both jurisdictions recognition to each other. Now, our Grand Master from Grand Lodge in New Jersey, back in 2005, decided that the time was right. You know, we got to end this. He was a great widow's son motorcycle rider, and his counterpart in Prince Hall was equally a widow's son motorcycle rider. And while they rode together, they didn't realize that the following year they would be Grand Masters together. And they decided to bring this accord together and unify and accept each other. However, Prince Hall was the one that first put roadblocks in the system. Many of our brethren flocked to Prince Hall to join and become dual members, to show their unity and their fellowship. And Prince Hall put the brakes on it and said, if you want to become a member of Prince Hall, you must demit from all other jurisdictions and just become ours. The other part was that we would go visit their entered apprentice, their fellow craft. We let them visit ours. But yet when a contingent of our brethren went to go visit their Master Mason degree, they were turned away. And this was later on found that they had two restrictions. You couldn't become a Prince Hall Freemason unless you were demitted from all the jurisdictions. And you could not see their Master Mason degree unless you were a full authorized dues-paying member in good standing of a Prince Hall. So yes, white men can join. Here in New Jersey, you must admit from the Grand Lodge of New Jersey. If I myself went to petition 2 years ago, and this is how we found out that this rule existed, and I was turned down. And I said, well, I've spoken to Prince Hall lodges. I've got many Prince Hall brothers that are friends, and they refused me. And that was the edict I got. And our Grand Secretaries exchanged in cordial letters, and it was determined that that was their stipulation, that we cannot join them unless we demit from Grand Lodge of New Jersey. So yes, you can join, but you can't be a member of another jurisdiction, which is kind of defeating the purpose and segregating themselves. And it's hard to imagine that they fought all those years to break those chains and bonds, and they're putting up the walls now to have full anonymity and full recognition. But unfortunately, that's the way it is in many parts of the United States.
Thank you, Moses. How many people were able to use the Underground Railroad and get to safety, and were any of those who helped them ever caught and punished?
Many were caught and punished. Many were killed in the underground movement. It's rough to say how many people actually used it. It's safe to say that tens of thousands of people, or over 1 million, migrated through that system of the Underground Railroad. Not all of them used the part that these brothers created, the Order of the Men of Oppression, but overall, it is estimated that well over 1 million, if not more, made their way from slavery into freedom, into the northern states or into Canada. And if you see the major migratorial paths, you see Cincinnati, Detroit, Chicago, New York, Newark. These have been major African American communities because of that time period. And as many communities in Canada as well, as Buxton, Ontario is one of the places where Prince Hall Freemasonry was first brought into Canada because of the laws banning slavery. And we see it grow there. The first Grand Master of New Jersey brought Freemasonry, Prince Hall Freemasonry, into Canada. And there he set up a shop and set up a community so that slaves coming across can have a place to stay. Now, the other part of the slavery is that it's easy to free somebody for the most part. It has its difficulties, but the other flip side is what Prince Hall was preaching, was that freeing a slave was just one part. But if you don't educate them, if you don't teach them, if you don't make them members of the community, active participant members of the community, what good will they be? These individuals don't know how to read, they don't know how to write, they've never owned land, they don't have a business, they don't know how to pay bills. If you don't teach them, if you don't educate them, then they will not become productive members of the community. And that was one of Prince Hall's mantra in the lodge. Use the lodge, use this fraternity to let these individuals see that men of color do know how to read and write and can be eloquent speakers and can be leaders in the community. And it must have been awe-inspiring for these young, newly freed slaves who have never seen a black man own a home, or a black man own a business, or walk in a three-piece suit and speak so eloquently and recite, poems and recite great works of art. To see that and then see these men walk into this building, and that must have been awe-inspiring to see them and say, well, who are these men? What planet did they come off? Did they come from that they could do this? And I believe that Freemasonry was an inspirational pivoting point in those communities and served that way, so that these individuals see that, no, it's not just slave, that you can be a free man, that you can live a productive life. And Freemasonry was a big part of that, and in their lives, in these communities that they spread.
Okay, thank you, Moses. This question's to do with the ritual that we use here in Scotland. And we are told we have to be freeborn to become a Freemason. And some rituals make mention of amputating part of the body. Have you, in your researches, ever come across any evidence that this was a fact rather than just Masonic legend when we take the tip of the finger off?
There were some areas in the beginning here, the part of the United States, where men who were, for instance, a person who was deaf or a person who was blind, how could you become a member? And some jurisdiction removed the born free to just say free man of duly age and coming of his own free will and accord, because they realized that these individuals who were sold into slavery, who were born free and then sold into slavery, or those who were born into slavery, did not have or choose that right, did not have that right to leave, or did not choose that life. So it was wrong for us now to be able to say to them, no, you can't be a Mason because you weren't born a free man. So many jurisdictions reworded that in their constitutions to make allowances for, as long as you're a free man of lawful age and coming under the tongue of the true Masonic report on your own free will and accord, that was enough to be made a Mason. And that was changed in many jurisdictions because of that, including Prince Hall, so that men of color who were slaves and were now physically free can now become Freemasons as well, and it could not be held against them.
Okay, thank you, Moses. We've got a hand held up from Luke Watson. Luke, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask Moses your question.
Hi, thank you very much. Thank you for the wonderful lecture. That was just eye-opening and incredibly wonderful. I actually had 2 questions. The first was, have you come across any changes to the laws and constitutions to reflect the abolition of slavery? And then the second part is, I assume we had brethren that were slave owners just because that was the time and the laws. If there were, do you feel this had any, do you think they had any moral obligations to this, or even came across them at all?
No, I've never seen any documentation or constitution changing their ways or their laws because of the abolishing of slavery or the underground movement. As I said, the one major issue was the removal of being born. Instead of being born a free man, a free man. And that was instrumental in allowing, because some constitutions in some jurisdictions were questioning, well, if it's in our constitution, it says you must be born a free man, and he was a slave, well, how can he now become a free man and become a Mason? So many jurisdictions took away that part so to incorporate that. But I don't see many, I've never come across anybody or any jurisdiction that having to change the ways for the Underground Railroad or mention of that. But the biggest step was removing that born free. That was a big step. And that was something that Prince Hall did not want to be a part of, because he knew that the bulk of his people were slaves and they would never become Freemasons if that was the case. So he had to be able to make changes to allow that once these men are born free or gain their freedom, that they would be able to become Freemasons. And it was thankful that they did, because many of those went on to become very influential, instrumental men, including Frederick Douglass, who was born a slave and gained his independence and became a statesman, one of the first black senators, and became one of the biggest advocates for anti-slavery and push for the 15th Amendment here in the United States. So it's amazing what just one word can do to keep people down. And when you change that phrase, that one word opens the doors to so many. As I said before, there are many good men that come across our lodge and are roughly turned away because of bigotry and racism and their personal feelings. And we should, as Masons, separate that from ourselves and just look at the candidate for who he is. And sometimes I wonder if a blind man has the best way, because he doesn't see anything except hearing a man in front of him. He doesn't see his color. He doesn't see what he preaches. He doesn't see where he comes from. And unfortunately, that's why I believe that we're blinded as we come through our degrees, because you're supposed to hear from your heart and in your ears and not see the person. So I believe that's what I firmly believe. But I've never come across of anything of jurisdiction changing other than born free to being a free man.
Moses, one final question before we say our final thank yous to you. Is the ritual of Prince Hall similar to the rituals of the Grand Lodge of Ireland, or is it very different? And if different, what are the main differences?
They're quite different. To be honest, brother, I've never seen. I've spoken in Ireland, but I've never seen a degree in Irish Constitution Lodge, so I can't say what they have actually done. And I've never seen the Master Mason degree in the Prince Hall. Interdependence and fellowcraft seem to be very similar in some ways to ours. Of course, all jurisdictions have similarities and differences, but it seems like he followed more of what he saw here, because I believe in a military lodge, it wasn't always as easy to convey a full lodge when you're in the middle of a battle or in the middle of encampment, popping up a tent and getting a few men together and having a lodge. And I believe he was more inspired by the ritual of what he saw here in the States here later on. And I'm sure Irish had a big part to do with it. But I believe a lot of it came from the writings of Smith and Preston and Webb, which the rituals which he primarily based it off of as well. But like I said, I've never seen an English Irish Constitution degree, so I can't say whether or not they are similar, the same. But for the most part, there are some similarities, some differences. But even here in New Jersey, they're quite the same. There's not too much differences between them, except that they're really sticklers on really tiling the lodge. I mean, they really take that to heart. They're not as free and liberties with, we'll open up a lodge and then we'll invite guests and friends. They're really, it's lodge, it's business, and that's it. They don't mix pleasure and open lodges. They don't have open meetings, and they tile their lodge really tile. They will question you. They will put the sword to you. They really believe that. As some of our jurisdictions are more open than more laxed, but yeah, no, unfortunately, I've never visited a Grand Island. Hopefully someday I will get to see some degrees in Ireland, but I have not to compare the two. But that was a good question. I've never thought about that.
Okay. I've got a final comment from one of the Lodge Hope of Karachi's past masters, Brother Alan.
Moses, thank you very, very much for a very, very inspiring talk. It was absolutely wonderful. A little piece of information for you. I live in Rotherham in England, and a mile away from me, at the bottom of my lane, is a place called Thundercliff Grange, which was the home of Thomas, 3rd Earl of Effingham. Now, he was the guy who was, you probably know, was acting Grand Master. Okay. And had the great privilege of taking another scholar you might know, Oscar Elaine, down there to listen to their historian. Thomas Earl of Effingham is very, very interesting to your story in that he was radical in the day, and although friends with the king, he was pro-universal plebiscite, anti-slavery, and also supporting the independence of America. He was the guy who, on his principles, signed Prince Hall's certificate because he was acting Grand Master.
Well, brother, I did not know, and that's really, really interesting. And you're getting my mouth is getting watery here because I really would love to hear more about that. I will investigate more. I had no idea about that. I had no knowledge of that.
He was a real radical and seriously into universal liberty, and it was that motivation that caused Prince Hall to get his certificate to create a Grand Lodge of Prince Hall.
Well, brother, if you would do me the favor, if Gordon, you'd be able to send him my email.
I will do.
Brother,
yeah, Gordon will do that, and I can post you some information on that part of it.
I would love to read more about that, brother. Every day I find something new, and I never stop learning. So thank you very much for that. I duly appreciate that.
No, thank you for your talk, Moses.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you, my brother.
Trevor, we've got a question you've posed, but for time, I will come back to you with your answer on the Facebook page. Brian, Moses, once again, on behalf of the members of the Lodge Hope of Karachi and all our visitors from across the world, can I thank you yet again for you giving us this daily advancement in such an emotional topic, but with a lot of inspiration. So once again, thank you. Brethren, moving forward to next week, we're staying in North America, and I'm delighted to announce that we will have Right Worshipful Brother Hugh Young, past Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Alberta, talk to us about Masonic pins. I've seen the presentation, Brian, and it's very colourful. So I do hope you can all join us next week at 7 o'clock. And as usual, I'll try and put up links on our Facebook pages this evening that relate to Brother Moses' presentation this evening, and also the live recording will probably arrive about 11:30, since it's been over an hour and a half that we've been engrossed with Moses' presentation. As I normally do, Brian, I will unmute you all so you can say your thank yous and goodbyes. I'll give you 20-30 seconds or so, and then I'll give the countdown until we cease recording and I close. Moses, thank you once again.
Thank you, my brother, and thank you all for allowing me to speak.
Thank you, Moses. Excellent.
Thank you, brother.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, brother Moses.
Good evening.
Excellent.
Everybody stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Moses.
Thank you, brother.
Inspirational, Moses. Inspirational. Thank you.
Thank you, brother. Stay safe.
Good night, Moses. Thank you.
Thank you very
Bye,
much,
brother.
Brother Moses. Very inspirational talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, my brother.
Thank you, Brother Moses. Very informative. Very good. Thank you.
Same here, brother. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Bernard. It's 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Good evening.
Good night.
Good night, brother.
Good night.